I'm so old that I've begun to forget stuff. So I have to use notes now. Remind me. My eyes are so bad that I can hardly read the notes. Anyway, it's interesting. Here we're about inclusion and community. In Vancouver, I think 2 years ago, the Vancouver Foundation commissioned a study of what people in Vancouver thought were the most significant problems from their own perspective. They did a sample of all the people in Vancouver, and they offered them a lot of choices as to what might be the most significant issue affecting you. Was it the price of housing? Was it crime? Was it the lack of employment? That kind of list. And when they were done, none of those things were chosen. Instead, the most frequent response to what is the biggest problem for you in Vancouver was loneliness. Something. Loneliness. Not crime, not jobs. Loneliness. And then last year, there was a study made in the United States, how many people live alone. And compared to 1985, in the United States, twice as many people live alone as they did just those short few years ago. Then there was a Harvard academic who did some studies having to do with how are people associating together. How many groups, clubs, and organizations do they belong to? How often do they have dinner with other people in the neighborhood at their houses? Do they give money to be helpful to the community or others? Those kind of questions. And what he found was he could trace from 1900, and so people were more and more involved in relationships that are associative in community. Every year, more and more people were involved in more and more associations until 1969. And in 1969, it flattened out. And by 1973, the relationships people had, this is in the United States, began to go down and down and down. And it's gone down every year. So the wonderful thing about being here is that this effort started 28 years ago. And it was focused on this question. How do we include people? How do we overcome loneliness, isolation, failure to have relationships? Which just now people are beginning to see as a big problem. So what's really wonderful here is we're ahead of the game. We've been at this for 28 years trying to figure out what do we do about these disastrous trends. And there's an ever-growing field of knowledge that is here and the experience of everybody who's here. And so this is a gathering. This is the postgraduate seminar on what do we do about the collapse of relationships in Canada and the United States at the local level. So because I've been at 27 of these 28 gatherings, one of the things we'll be doing is sharing at least what I've learned over that period of time about several questions. Why is it that so many people have become isolated. Be honest, we could all just right now look, why is this happening? And the second is, how do people get isolated? And the third is, how do people get connected? And the fourth is, what is it that happens when people get connected? Those are the four questions we'll be examining in this module. And we'll also be exploring what is the difference between an inclusion initiative that is based in an agency as against based in a citizen organization in community. What's the difference for the plus and minus of those two approaches? Another thing we'll be discussing is what is the language of inclusion? I was in the university for a good many years, but I was also involved in neighborhood organizing and research, and had been a neighborhood organizer. So I would go out of the neighborhood, and I would go into the university, and I'd go back in the neighborhood, and what you could see immediately is there were two languages, completely different. In the university, people knew things by studies, and that's what they talked about. And in the neighborhood, people knew things by stories, and that's what they talked about. So the language of inclusion is very important. How do we think and talk about a world of connectedness? And what kind of language gets in the way, leads us astray? And what is an includer like? If we're for inclusion, what is the including activity, the includer like? And that all is a little mechanistic in its definition, but the overarching, I think, word is hospitality. What we'll be looking at is the nature of hospitality, the nature of welcoming, the nature of neighboring. My mother, we lived when I was a kid in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a pretty working class neighborhood, inner city neighborhood. And there was a depression. At the time I'm thinking about 1/3 of the people in the United States were unemployed. And next, my mother was an Irish woman. My wife used to call her Mrs. Clean. And next door to us came from the hills of Kentucky some people, a family. My mother didn't look on them well. They had dirty clothes. They didn't speak correct English. They looked peakedy and unhealthful. And she didn't think it was a good idea for her children, me, to play with the kids next door. One day, Mr. Tall, the father in the family next door, lost his job. And when you lost your job in the Depression, nobody would say, well, I'll find another one next week. Because over a third of the people around us didn't have jobs. And so, my mother, when she found out Mr. Tall had lost his job, went next door and said to Mrs. Tall, listen, I know it's going to be hard for you. I'll cook dinner for you until he gets a job again. We have 4 children. They were a family of 4, we were a family of 5. And my father had a job, and a good job, but we had enough money to buy dinner. And so for 3 years, she cooked a dinner for 9 people. And when I was about 30, I remembered this, and I said to her, Mom, why did you do that? You didn't like the dolls. Why did you do that? And she said, just as though it was perfectly apparent, well, John, they were our neighbors. John, they were our neighbors. Now, my mother was speaking about relationships and care. It didn't come from a program. It came from the culture in which she resided. And the culture said, when your neighbor doesn't eat, you feed him. And incidentally, I now know, doing some other reading, my mother was not unusual. For nobody died in the streets of hunger during the Depression, as bad as it was. Because friends and neighbors did what was necessary for people to survive, because they cared about neighbors. So the last thing I'd like to examine in our module is, if we're really interested in relationships of care, the question, I think, is a cultural question. Something was, nobody ever taught my mother that you feed your neighbor. But the culture said it to everyone. So, what might we do if we said, maybe we could have a culture of care in our neighborhood? Maybe we could be people who are deeply responsible to each other. And how could that begin to be our way? Now, I do know from a lot of the research that we've done that most people who are over 50 or 60, when you ask them, tell me about how things were on your block as you were a child, they tell story after story of how the neighbors took responsibility for them, for their safety, for their behavior, for their learning. I can count on it. I'll get that story. But as I go down the age group, 50, 40, 30, everybody here's under 30, I don't get the story very much. I don't hear about a block like that. So, the amazing thing to me is that in 2 generations, we lost the culture of care. Just 2 generations. And yet there are a whole lot of people who know about that. I call them our elders, who recognizes that is Native Americans. So what we're going to explore is, can we recover the knowledge that was everywhere and is in every experience of our elders? So that's what I think we're trying to examine in this module. Now we have 3 hours, and I've recruited a colleague. I'll do the first 2 hours, and I've recruited a colleague to lead us through the 3rd hour, because he is one of the great adventurers moving out of the box, looking at ways to see the culture that is there and to expand the culture even